Hello and welcome to Tales from the Dragon's Library. Pardon me, still fighting off this sort of chest congestion, sore throat thing going on. So anyway, if you guys have not seen this show, I did this last year with my previous book, Embers of Liberty, and it was an idea I got from another writer at Gen Con, sort of symposium networking class thing that he was given. He talked about how he did a YouTube show where I think he actually wrote a book during that process, not just necessarily editing. But unfortunately, my writing process wouldn't be very conducive to a show. So I thought that it would be fun to do editing at the same time. So I think I've gotten far enough in my current work of progress, which actually does not have a title yet. I'm calling it Maya's Saga only because the main character's name is Maya, and I know the trilogy is going to be about her, but I don't yet have a title for book one. So for now, that's what we're going to call it. This is going to be sort of like an interactive... Hold on, I want to make sure the volume's working too. Don't have my headset on, which is nice, but then I can't tell if the volume's working. But anyway, this will be sort of an interactive audiobook slash like writing YouTube sort of class, maybe, I guess you could say. You're going to hear me read from my current work in progress exactly as it's written. I'm going to be looking for things that need to be changed, things that don't make sense. Very good advice is to read your work out loud. So I will be going through that process, which is very important to the editing process. And hopefully we'll be able to do this consistently every other week or so on Thursday afternoons. I think I'm going to do about an hour rather than two like I used to, because I don't want to get too far ahead. Right now I'm currently on chapter 9 for the first draft process. And if I go too fast, then we're going to catch up to where I am, and then we're going to have to take long breaks in between episodes. But for now, hopefully you enjoy this. If you are watching the live show, if you have questions, if something I read doesn't make sense, if something catches your eye that maybe I don't notice, the one big thing with writers is we are terrible editors, especially of our own work. We know what it's supposed to say, so it's easy for a writer to it's easier for a writer's eyes and brain to skip over words or phrases that we know what they're supposed to mean, but they don't necessarily make sense, or there might be a very blatant typo or wrong word usage in a sentence, and it doesn't immediately click with us because, again, we wrote it. We know what it's supposed to mean, so we don't always see those mistakes. So feel free to call out questions in the chat. If you're watching the recordings, drop a comment if you see something that's really out of the ordinary, or catch me on the next show and just say, hey, something here is kind of goofy, and we'll talk about it and see what we could do from here. So anyway, we are going to get started with chapter 1 of the first book of Maya's Saga, and this is set in my own fantasy world. If you have read any of my short stories that are in When Heroes Rise, my short story collection, then you will be somewhat familiar with this world, and you will be familiar with some of the characters that we're going to come into contact with as we get into this book. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully my throat holds up at least for an hour, because I've been fighting this coughing stuff for a while now. All right. What did he say, priest? Tamarin Sadek growled. Tamarin scowled as he said the last word. He disliked the cowering sycophants. I actually think I can become a little more economical here, because if I'm going to follow that up with that, I was going to say, what did he say, priest? Tamarin scowled as he growled the last word. He disliked the cowering sycophants who devoted their lives to serving some unseen power. He suffered their existence because it was a power he couldn't control, and that made it doubly vexing. The priest kneeled without speaking, drawing out the silence. Tamarin knew the cleric was choosing his words carefully, and it angered him further. The priests were always trying to manipulate him. Tamrin's leather armor creaked as he shifted on the throne to lean over the robed figure on the mosaic tiles at his feet. Sharp teeth scraped against his lip as he ground them with impatient frustration. The Divine One did not name the child, Highness. Tamrin could hear the contempt in the priest's voice. The kneeling man continued. The child will be unusual for our people, that much is clear. It may have already been born, or is yet. My damn dog. Every time I stream, he does this. He doesn't do this at any other time. All of a sudden, he started this barking crap. Sorry, it just kills me. I don't know why he does it. The child would be unusual for our people, that much is clear. It may have already been born, or is yet to be, for a handful of years. I don't know if we need a comma there or not. Or is yet to be for a handful. I think we can take out for a handful of years. May have already been born, or is yet to be. The Divine One said the child will be the end of our civilization, our destruction. Tamrin sat back with a grunt and turned his head to look at the magnificent stained glass lining one wall of the airy great hall. He flexed his fingers to relieve the tension in his joints. The white fur of his hands reflected the colored light from the windows. Sharp claws extended from the tips of the digits as he curled them against the armrest. Finally, he scratched gently at the tufts of white fur along his chin and fixed silver eyes, slit like a cat's, on the priest. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped when a side door clicked softly and a young woman entered the hall. She was attempting to be quiet, but both men turned to her briefly. Your Imperial Majesty, the kneeling priest bowed further as the woman approached. Tamrin watched her walk slowly toward the throne. Her furred hand rested on her distended belly, caressing it almost absently as if soothing a child or lover. The female's features were softer than his own, but no less feline. Silver cat-like eyes watched them both as she moved toward them gracefully. Despite her advanced stage of pregnancy... Excuse me, I didn't put that in there correctly. Silver cat-like eyes watched them both as she moved toward them gracefully, despite her advanced stage of pregnancy. She was young, having been promised to Tamrin when she was a child. They had only bonded a year when she became pregnant. He could still see the uncertainty in her eyes, the same as she'd had when he crowned her his empress at their bonding. Tamrin studied her a few moments more. His eyes settled on her stomach before he spoke again. For a moment he wished he could take her and the child away from the Empire. We cannot take the risk, but we will need to take more slaves to make up for the loss of future soldiers. The Emperor turned back to the priest. Highness? The priest had clearly not followed the obvious internal decision. They'll all have to be put to the sword. The priest hesitated, looking between the Emperor and his mate. Surely the noble families, the priest began to protest. I said all of them, the Emperor roared. His sharp teeth gleamed as he leaned in close to the priest. Husband? The Empress stepped forward, her hands clutched protectively over her stomach. She did not know the topic of their conversation, but what little she had heard scared her. The Emperor turned baleful eyes on his mate. He could not help feeling a bit of pride in how protective she was over the precious life she carried. She would make a better mate than he expected, and a strong mother to his children. Unfortunately, not this child. One thing I want to look at real quick before we continue is I did print these out, and I had some edits that I want to make sure that I get in off of the handwritten copies as we get to those sections, because I had not yet gone through and done more editing here. Ice. I don't want to chew on ice while we do this. A child will come that will destroy our very civilization. It could even be ours, and the risk is too great, my dear. He softened his voice, but there was still an edge that let the other two Tarkil know he was firm in his decision. But it will be our child to raise properly. Our own blood will be no danger to us, the Empress cried, stepping back from the throne as it prepared to flee. I will not risk our entire civilization on the possibility that we can avert prophecy by being good parents. The Emperor's voice lowered into a throaty growl at the end. You're a mon... The Empress began, but was cut off when the steel returned to her mate's eyes. Be very careful what you say, my dear, the Emperor growled. I think we do need commas there. Yeah, we need commas there. Be very careful what you say, my dear, the Emperor growled. Treason carries a harsh penalty, even for the Empress. The young woman could only stare helplessly as the weight of her situation settled on her shoulders. She backed slowly toward the side door, horror and revulsion plain in her lovely features. The Emperor watched her go, keeping his gaze even and unyielding. Then when the door closed, he turned back to the priest. Need a comma there for sure. Okay. The sacrifice of your own child will go a long way toward appeasing some of the families, but if you will resist, the robed Tarkil said calmly. If there is any resistance, make an example of the first family that balks, the Emperor said quietly and sat back into a more relaxed pose. Yes, Highness. The priest rose slightly, still bent nearly double, and backed out of the hall. He didn't turn around until the heavy doors were closing behind him. Tamrin Sadek gave himself a moment to drop his composure when he was finally alone, except for 2 guards. The Imperial Guard were trained to hear and see nothing until it was required. It was easy to forget they were even in the room. The Emperor could not afford to ever show weakness, but this new development caused him a great deal of stress. The order he just gave could cause civil war at worst. At best, it will cost him the loyalty of several noble families. On top of that was the loss of future new soldiers for several years. The Tarkil Empire had been a conquering force all across the south and east for generations. Their enemies were many and powerful. He was already calculating the number of extra slaves that would be required, and it was staggering. The Emperor gestured to one of the guards at the main door. The 2 Tarkil soldiers stood at rigid attention. Their leather cuirass that covered simple tunics were dyed red to denote their station in the Empire's military. Each was armed with a spear and a short, wide-bladed sword. Matching helmets and red leather boots completed their uniform. They were barely distinguishable from each other Good Lord. Astonus! Come here. What a jerk. What a jerk. Each was armed with a spear and a short, wide-bladed sword. Matching helmets and red leather boots completed their uniform. They were barely distinguishable from each other unless an observer took note of the markings on their exposed fur. One of them ran to kneel before the throne. He waited silently while the Emperor gathered his thoughts. Send for General Reish. Tell him to bring 2 officers he trusts, he said at last. I think I'm going to change red leather boots because I think I've established that the Tarkil military wear sandals laced up like, I guess similar to what the Romans would wear as far as their sandals, the way they laced up their legs toward their knees. The guard simply nodded and rushed off without a word. The heavy doors boomed closed, and the Emperor was reminded of the tolling of a death bell. The thought made him uneasy, and he said a silent prayer that everything he was doing would be enough to save his people. He wasn't a religious man, but he also couldn't deny the existence of the divine. I think I'm going to say, because I don't really say who he prays to. Whatever God here, that everything was going. The thought made him uneasy, and he said a silent prayer to whatever God could hear, to whichever. Could hear him, that everything he was doing would be enough to save his people. He wasn't a religious man, but he also couldn't deny the existence of the divine. So if you're not familiar with my world, there are many gods in the world's pantheon, and this particular people worship sort of a power, they call it. It hasn't really been established yet what that power is, or what keeps popping up over there. It hasn't really been established what that power is, or who they worship. But we're getting there. But he doesn't worship the same deity as the priests that do. Oh, I see what's popping up. My Steam notifications. You guys are seeing my friends pop on and off Steam. All right, so several minutes passes in the cavernous hall while the Emperor still chewed on the implications of his decision. Finally, 3 male Tarkil marched through the door. The first was a large man with gray stripes on his white hair and fur, dressed in a long black leather tunic with muscled arms and legs bare. He wore his leather armored skirt that he wore a leather armored skirt that fell to his knees, but he was otherwise unadorned. He was older than the Emperor and bore a long scar along the left side of his face, nearly bisecting his eye. The other two wore the standard wool and chainmail uniforms of the Emperor's soldiers. I'm going to change that standard wool and black leather uniforms of the Empire's soldiers. When the three reached the throne, they knelt. The leader stood after the gesture, while the other two remained on their knees. "How can we serve, my lord?" General Riche asked. "General, I have given an order to the priest which is likely to turn a few houses against me," the Emperor began. "I may need to call the army into the city to maintain order," Tamarin continued. The general nodded. "We will also need to increase our intake of fighting slaves. We will have need of them over the next several years." The general nodded again and saluted when the Emperor looked to the other two soldiers. "You two, I have a special task for you." The two soldiers both rose and stood at attention to receive their orders. "The Empress will soon give birth, and I have a task that must be accomplished without fail." The Emperor went on to detail the gruesome mission the soldiers would be performing in the near future. The two listened silently and simply saluted when he was finished. The three were dismissed without further discussion. Alright, so we are going to have a scene break here. What are we, 20 minutes in? Okay. The birth was sooner than expected. Only days after his fateful decision, Emperor Tamarin Sadek waited anxiously in the hall outside his mate's rooms. He looked toward the closed door every time a muffled wail rang out behind the wooden portal. Guards were posted at each end of the hall, and two soldiers stood tensely near the door with naked swords in hand. All of the males had been ushered out of the room by the midwife, and none of them were inclined to argue. The soldiers would not be needed until the child was born, and there was nothing Tamarin could do but wait. Another screeching wail cut through the door, and the Emperor started. They'd been waiting for hours now, and his nerves were raw from stress and the noise. The anxiety over what was going to happen next wasn't helping. The last scream was cut off abruptly, and the Emperor tensed. The two soldiers by the door shifted, ready to move on his order. A low moan, followed by a keening wail, preceded the door, opening to reveal a grim-faced midwife. Tamarin looked past her into the room and saw, with some relief, the Empress still moving. She was clutching a bundle to her chest and rocking slightly. Several nurses and maids moved about, cleaning up after the night's ordeal. "The child did not survive, Your Highness," the midwife reported quietly. Another wail from the Empress brought him back to the moment, and he looked at the midwife. His mind could not process the unexpected news. "What did you say?" The woman cringed as her lord's gaze settled on her fully. She shrank back and lowered her eyes. "Your son, Highness. He did not survive the ordeal." He was surprised by a wave of regret and sorrow that settled in the pit of his stomach like a piece of bad meat. He pushed past the midwife and went to his grieving mate, followed by the 2 soldiers. The room stank of sweat and blood and faintly of death. He looked down at the still form of his mate. He looked down at the still form his mate was holding on to, like she was clinging to her own thread of life. He realized his order to kill the child had been unnecessary and ultimately damaging to his bond with the Empress. She looked at him once when he approached, then at the soldiers, and her eyes went hard as steel before turning back to the bundle in her arms. The priest should have known this child would not live to be the danger they feared. Tammin reached out to smooth his mate's sweat-soaked hair and grimaced when she cringed away from his touch. He pulled back and clenched his fist, his claws digging into his palm. "Find the high priest," he growled at the armed soldiers. "I want his head brought to me in the great hall." The soldiers saluted and left the room in a rush. The Emperor looked down at his grieving mate for a moment and then followed the soldiers to leave her to her mourning. So that's the first or introductory chapter. It's a shorter one than most of the others. I just wanted to make sure that I sort of set that scene well. And I've actually edited this chapter a couple of times, so I didn't make a whole lot of changes there. But that would be chapter 1, and I think we do have, unfortunately, I think what's going to happen is I'm going to get ahead of myself so quickly. But we are going to jump into chapter 2 for a little bit and see how far we get. Excuse me. But I think we're going to find that some chapters are going to take longer. Because they're this chapter is a bit longer than the previous chapter. And I think may also require a few more edits. So let's start chapter 2 here. The little Tarkil girl danced in a circle in a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees. Low shrubs made a screen between the trunks, cut only by a path back to her home a short distance away. Her small furred feet were bare and muddy up to her ankles, and her plain dress of gray wool swirled around her knees as she turned in circles around the glade. The only part of her that was clean was the stream of silver hair that flowed down her head and shoulders and whipped around her like a shining flag as she danced. There was no music to be heard or audience to watch, and she moved like she was the only person in the world. Her eyes were closed and her mouth split by an elated smile, showing the tiny pointed canine teeth of her kind. When she threw her head back, the sun and the shadow of the leaves dappled her face in light and dark. She was in her own world for just a little while, enjoying the silence and solitude of her private spot. Her dance stopped abruptly when she heard the sound of other children laughing and shouting deeper in the wood. She wanted to investigate, but her mother didn't like her wandering too far from home. She had to stay close enough to hear her parents call from the small yard around her little house. The laughter rang out again, and the little girl's curiosity overcame her caution. She crept through the brush toward the sound. The Korean forest grew thick and tangled off the game trails and paths. For a child of 8 summers, the brambles and brush were no deterrent, however. She pushed through the clutching branches bordering her little sanctuary, pausing only briefly to tug on her dress when the hem caught on a thorn. It came free with only a small rip. She paid it no mind other than to remind herself she'd have to repair it after dinner. Her parents were simple traders in plants and herbs and didn't have much money. Her habit of running in the woods and damaging her clothes prompted her mother to teach her to sew at an early age. Once through the bordering growth, she ended up on the game trail that she knew opened out at a small pond where local children often gathered to swim and play. She figured that was the source of the sound and picked up the pace, running down the track toward the sounds of children at play. I think we're going to... Yeah, there we go, toward the laughter and shouts. The wind blew up from the water, rustling leaves and carrying the smell of algae and standing water. Like... The breeze was warm in the early high summer afternoon, promising another hot, humid month in the southern forest. Excuse me. It wasn't long before the trail opened up to the clearing that housed the popular swimming hole. The wind blew a little harder, rustling the wispy tufts of fur along her jaw and slightly pointed ears. Her cat-like silver eyes scanned the clearing and settled on 3 older Tarkill boys she recognized from the nearby village. The trio were standing over something on the ground. As she watched, one of the boys threw a stone at whatever was at her feet. Their target, a bird, she realized, tried to fly away but only managed a startled flutter before the stone hit it. The poor creature fell heavily to the ground, and the boys laughed and looked around for another stone. Let's see if we've had any edits that I had marked down. I don't think we have. The girl wanted to run out and stop them, but they were bigger than her, known to be cruel bullies in the village. All the children in the village were bigger than her, but her parents told her she was just small for her age. They seemed odd when they said it. They seemed odd when they said it, but she never knew them to lie to her. I don't like that sentence. I think we're going to take that out. She knew the boys... She knew the boys would hurt her if she interrupted their play. She looked around for anything that might be of use to distract the boys. Distract them. I think we're going to take that and get to the bird. Her eyes settled on the pond and an idea formed in her head. I think we're going to change. We've used pond a couple times, so I think we're saying small watering hole. Had a rocky outcropping along one side where the water was clear and local children jumped from the rocks to swim. On the opposite end, the ground was low and muddy. A scummy film of foul-smelling algae collected along the reeds. The older children liked to tell stories of things that lived in the little swamp. Some of the tales involved children who had wandered too close and were never seen again. It was said that they return as swamp ghosts that could be heard. Swamp ghosts and could be heard at night moaning and crying for someone to help them. No one had seen any of the rumored monsters, but everyone avoided the area anyway. She was never scared of the stories herself, but avoided the area because of the smell. But stayed out because of the smell. Hi, buddy. What do you need, buddy? You're fine. While the boys were focused on their game, she darted out and slipped into the shallow water among the reeds. The smell of rotting things and stagnant water made her gag, but she submerged herself anyway, swimming underwater toward the worst part of the putrid morass. She crawled slowly from the shallows, letting the algae stick to her hair and shoulders as she surfaced. She dragged her lower body through the mud of the bank and slowly stood in a hunched crouch. Her dress clung to her bony form like a rotted garment of ages past. Her wet hair, foul and green, hung about her like seaweed. She left it hanging around her face even as the smell turned her stomach. Taking a deep breath of rancid air, she stepped out of the reeds and turned toward the boys. Seeing them now armed with sticks, she hesitated. I think we need a comma there. If her plan didn't work, they could do her real harm. Building up her determination, she hunched her shoulders in what she thought, or hoped, would make her look like something other than herself. The boys were arguing over whose turn it was to torment the poor creature fluttering at their feet. The girl took halting steps toward the boys and started to low in an imitation of how the older boys described their legendary swamp creature. It was a few moments and a few more steps before the boys noticed her. When one of them did, his reaction was immediate, and he stepped back and slapped his friend's shoulder to draw his attention to the apparition approaching them. "What?" The boy saw his friend's horrified stare and followed the look with his own slitted eyes. "What in hell's?" the second boy exclaimed when he saw the foul-smelling creature that was approaching. The third and largest looked up and stepped forward to see better. He hesitated, then slowly raised his stick. "One of the swamp things," the first boy said, taking another step back in preparation to flee. "No such thing," the third boy said. Despite his words, the girl could tell he was scared. Thinking quickly, she made her steps a little more jerky and looked up at them through the curtain of filthy hair covering her face. Seeing their terror building, she let out a blood-curdling scream she hoped sounded as monstrous as possible. The screeching wail brought the other boy up short and was enough for the other two. Fur raised on their neck and necks. Starting to stumble over words now. Fur raised on their necks and ears and cat-like eyes widened. Oh my gods. They bolted for the safety of the trees and home. Ran home. Why does he have to do that? I don't get it. The last boy took one last look. One final look at the malodorous creature stalking toward him, but all nerve fled with his friends. He dropped the stick and joined them in the flight to safety. The girl wasted no time rushing to the fallen bird lying in the muddy grass at the water's edge. The bird wasn't moving, and blood mixed with the mud and red rivulets pouring into the ground. She thought it was dead and began to cry in frustration that she had been too slow. Then a twitch, followed by a weak flutter, let her know the poor creature was still alive. She gave a hoarse cry of relief and carefully picked up the bird in the hem of her dress and bolted for the trail that would take her to her little glade and then home. While she ran, she could feel the little bird move, but it was weak and getting weaker. The creature's heart was beating rapidly in shock and fear, but slowly as she ran through the trees and brush. Slowing as she ran through the trees and brush. It was almost like she could feel its heartbeat through her whole body, pounding in her ears and behind her eyes. Tears streamed down her muddy face, cutting trails through the muck. She reached into the dress pouch to try and soothe the bird, and her fingers brushed the wound briefly. A shock, like being too close to a lightning strike, coursed through her body. The hairs on the back of her neck and tufts of her ears stood out, and she shivered like cold water poured down her back. The feeling lasted for barely a breath, but it felt like a lifetime to the girl who had never felt anything like it before. She stumbled and fell to her knees, skinning them on the hard ground. She gasped for breath as the pain in her knees brought her back to reality. She knew she'd never been near an animal in so much pain, and she wondered if it was like that for everyone else. Did her father get that feeling whenever he dressed an animal he had killed for food and furs? She wished she knew what to do to help the bird and take its pain away. She smoothed the bird's feathers and whispered to it that everything would be fine. Climbing to her feet, she rushed off again to the one person she thought could help, her mother. The feeling that had coursed through her started to subside, and her legs weakened as she ran. A sick feeling rose in the pit of her stomach, and the bird began to thrash desperately. The pounding heartbeat in her own, or the bird's, or both, beat in her head now like mallets on a drum. She covered the bird with the hem of her dress, afraid it would fall from her hands. She pushed on despite her sore legs and the building nausea, hoping she would get home in time. Minutes passed as she ran, or was it longer? She rushed into the yard of the small house as an older Tarkill woman was stepping out of the front door. The girl's mother was pretty for a Tarkill. She had long gray hair that she kept twisted atop her head. Her blue eyes were set in a face mostly marked by gray and black spots in her fur. She was mostly unremarkable as far as Tarkill go. The house was simple but not poor. It was well maintained, as was the garden and flower bed in the side yard. The house itself was mostly wood, with a stone chimney on one wall trailing smoke from the evening meal. Maya, what have you gotten into? The woman asked sharply. The girl realized how she must look to her mother. She suddenly regretted she hadn't taken the time to at least rinse off the mud and grime before leaving the pond. The anger she saw in the woman's eyes melted to concern as she got closer. She could see the blood on the child's hand. She who? Her mother could see the blood on her hands and knees. Excuse me. The girl's face. We're going to do that because I didn't. Let's try that again. So, her mother could see the blood on Maya's hands and knees. The girl's face was streaked with a mixture of tears, mud, and algae. The mess of her hair and dress had dried to a greenish brown and was tangled and torn. Her bloody hands clutched her torn dress in an equally bloody mass against her stomach, but the older woman did not know what was inside. Mama, Maya took a shuddering breath, her eyes brimming with tears and shoulders heaving. The bird, the girl gasped out between breaths. It's hurt. She offered the bundle up without opening her dress. Oh dear, let me see what you have there, her mother said. The woman knelt in front of her and gently unwrapped Maya's sticky fingers from around the precious cargo. The bird began to struggle as the girl's hold loosened, and after a moment her mother had the bundle open. The little brown bird fluttered and jumped from the girl's hands to the ground. Maya cried out in dismay and surprise, and her mother sat back on her heels to avoid the flapping wings near her face. The bird's beady black eyes looked at the woman, then settled on Maya for a long moment. There was something in the look between the girl and the bird. Was it gratitude? The bird broke the connection, ruffled its feathers to loosen the dried mud and blood, took 2 short hops, and lifted itself into the air with a flutter of wings. But Maya started, and then stopped. Maya, sorry for the crinkling, I need a cough drop. Maya, her mother's voice was returning to its earlier level of frustration. Mama, it was hurt, I swear. Tears sprang anew to the girl's eyes. Unable to remain upset at her daughter, the woman pulled Maya into her arms and soothed her with motherly expertise. She shushed the sobbing girl and rubbed her back gently. After a moment, the girl stiffened and cried out in pain. What is it, dear? Are you hurt, too? The woman held her daughter out at arm's length to see if she was injured. Maya was grimacing in pain and holding her stomach. Mama, my tummy hurts. Maya coughed, and blood flecked her lips. To her mother's horror, the little girl's eyes rolled back. She pitched forward into the woman's arms. So we're going to go ahead and stop there. Just because I don't want to get too far ahead. We're going to get ahead anyway because, again, I'm on Chapter 9 currently. And that only took, an hour to read 2 chapters. So we will see where we get next time. And there's the possibility that this show, we may take it to writing as well as just editing. We'll see how far that goes. But we are going to stop here. If you have any questions, ideas, things that struck you as strange and you're watching this recording, be sure to drop it in the comments. Let me know what didn't work for you. Why can't I get this binder clip on here? If you're watching the recording, though, and you do like this, be sure to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think of the show. Check out our other shows. Saturday morning, I do Saturday Randomness, where I play newer video games. On Monday night, I do Monday Night Classics. And then Friday nights I do have a geek sort of podcast where I talk about news and games and video games and comic books and things like that. Probably won't have an episode this week. Don't really have that much that's going on to talk about, but we'll see. I don't think we'll have one tomorrow, though, really. We will pick this up in a couple weeks, depending on my schedule, but I will announce it as usual like everything else. So if you did like the show, share it with everybody out there. Appreciate you guys stopping by. Hopefully I will see you next time or on one of the other shows. Let me know if you have any other... Oh, let me highlight this real quick so I know where we were last time. And yeah, that's it for tonight's show. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. I will see you next time. Much love.